Reverend Charles Monroe's life was one that many admired. In New Orleans, he had built a reputation as a pillar of the community. His sermons were powerful yet comforting, emphasizing themes of redemption and the enduring strength of faith. Members of his congregation often sought his guidance, believing him to be a man of unshakable morals and wisdom. At home, he seemed equally steadfast, a loving husband to his wife, Evelyn, and a doting father to their grown son, Marcus. But beneath the surface, Charles's world was beginning to fracture. For years, Charles had maintained a strict routine. Mornings were spent in quiet prayer, afternoons in counseling sessions with parishioners, and evenings in his study preparing sermons. Evelyn knew her husband as a man of discipline and devotion, always quick to offer a smile or comforting word. But recently, those small gestures had vanished. His demeanor grew tense and guarded, his once bright eyes clouded with worry. Evelyn first noticed a change in Charles during dinner one evening. He had been unusually quiet, picking at his food and barely engaging in conversation. When she asked if something was troubling him, he brushed her off with a forced smile. But the signs of strain became harder to ignore. He spent hours pacing in his study, his footsteps echoing through the house late into the night. On more than one occasion, Evelyn caught him staring out the window, his expression a mix of fear and deep contemplation. Even his behavior at church began to shift. Charles, who had always delivered impassioned sermons, now seemed distant, his words lacking their usual conviction. Congregants whispered about the pastor's apparent exhaustion, noting his absence from key meetings and community events. Evelyn heard the murmurs but chose to ignore them, convinced that her husband's troubles were temporary. Eventually, Evelyn confronted Charles directly, unable to bear his silence any longer. He hesitated, his hands trembling as he finally confessed that the church's treasury had been stolen. The funds, meant to support various community programs and maintain the church itself, were gone without a trace. Charles admitted that he feared being accused of stealing the money for personal use. The thought of tarnishing his reputation and losing the trust of his congregation consumed him with dread. Evelyn, ever supportive, acted quickly to ease his burden. She reached out to her sister, who had always been generous in times of need, and borrowed a significant sum to replace the missing funds. With the money in hand, Charles was able to reassure the church's board that the financial discrepancy had been resolved. For a brief period, it seemed as though the crisis had been averted. Charles appeared to return to his old self, smiling more often and engaging with his family and congregation again. Evelyn felt a sense of relief, believing that her husband had overcome the worst of his troubles. She admired his resilience and was glad she could help him through what she assumed was an isolated incident. But the reprieve was short-lived. Within weeks, Charles began to retreat into himself once more. He avoided eye contact with Evelyn and spent hours locked in his study, emerging only to give sermons that felt hollow and uninspired. His sleep became erratic, plagued by nightmares that left him visibly shaken in the mornings. Evelyn's attempts to comfort him were met with vague reassurances or silence. Evelyn's concern deepened as she watched the man she had loved for decades become a shadow of himself. She tried to piece together what might have triggered his relapse, but found no clear answers. The mystery weighed heavily on her, leaving her feeling helpless and increasingly anxious. Evelyn Monroe's phone buzzed late one evening, pulling her from her restless thoughts. She had spent the day worrying about Charles, his erratic behavior weighing heavily on her mind. At first, she ignored the notification, thinking it might be an automated alert or an inconsequential message. But something compelled her to check. What she saw made her blood run cold. The message was anonymous, with no sender information visible. Attached was a video file and a single line of text: "Your husband has stopped answering my calls. Tell him if he doesn't pay up, I'll release the full video." Hesitant yet unable to resist, Evelyn tapped on the video. The grainy footage was unmistakable. It showed Charles in an intimate encounter with another man, the scene undeniably damning. Evelyn's hands shook as she processed what she had just seen. Her stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The betrayal she felt was profound. For over 30 years, she had stood by Charles, trusting him as a loyal husband and a man of faith. Now, that trust lay in pieces, shattered by the stark reality playing out on her phone screen. As the initial wave of shock subsided, Evelyn's emotions swirled into a chaotic storm. Anger and heartbreak competed with confusion and a growing sense of dread. But beneath the raw pain, Evelyn recognized the deeper implication of the message. Charles wasn't just unfaithful, he was being blackmailed. Whoever had sent the video knew her husband's position in the community and intended to exploit it. Evelyn sat frozen, the phone still in her hand, replaying the message in her mind. The line "he doesn't pay up" stood out, confirming her suspicions about the church treasury theft. Her mind began connecting the dots. The missing funds, Charles's increasing anxiety, and now this, it all fit together. This wasn't just a private betrayal, it was a public scandal waiting to erupt. Steeling herself, Evelyn confronted Charles that same night. She found him in his study, staring blankly at a closed Bible on his desk. The moment she walked in, he knew something was wrong. When she showed him the video, his face paled, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of the revelation. For a moment, there was only silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Charles broke down, the tears flowing freely as he began to confess. He admitted that he had struggled with feelings for men for years, feelings he had buried beneath layers of faith and duty. He had convinced himself that those desires were sinful temptations to be resisted, but recently, the burden of repression had become too much. One impulsive decision had led him to a brothel, where, for the first time, he acted on those feelings. Charles explained that he had been unaware of the hidden cameras recording the encounter. It wasn't until weeks later that the threats began. The owners of the brothel had recognized him and realized the value of the footage. They demanded monthly payments in exchange for their silence, threatening to ruin his reputation and expose his secrets if he refused. Desperate and terrified, Charles had stolen from the church treasury to make the first payment. He knew it was wrong, but the fear of losing everything, his family, his congregation, and his standing in the community, had clouded his judgment. The shame of his actions, combined with the ongoing extortion, had driven him to the brink. Evelyn listened, her heart breaking anew with every word. She saw the depth of Charles's remorse, his anguish over the harm he had caused. Yet, her own pain was equally profound. The man she thought she knew had hidden so much from her, and now, she was left to grapple with the fallout of his choices. As Charles continued to sob, Evelyn wrestled with her emotions. Part of her wanted to lash out, to demand answers to questions she wasn't even sure how to ask. But another part recognized that anger wouldn't solve their problems. They were in this together, whether she liked it or not, and she knew they needed a plan to confront the blackmailers and protect what remained of their lives. Evelyn Monroe's mind raced as she tried to piece together what was happening to her husband. Charles's confession and the blackmail plot had left her shaken, but her determination to find a solution was unwavering. She suggested hiring a private investigator, someone discreet and experienced who could uncover the identities of the blackmailers and neutralize their threats. Evelyn believed that exposing their operation would not only protect Charles but also end the cycle of fear that had consumed their lives. But Charles refused. His rejection was immediate and absolute. He argued that involving anyone else, especially a professional, would only spread the scandal further. The thought of others discovering his secret, his congregation, his colleagues, even his son, was too much for him to bear. He vowed to resolve the situation himself, claiming it was the only way to protect their family and his reputation. Despite Evelyn's protests, Charles remained adamant. She watched him retreat into his study, his hands trembling as he leafed through papers, his mind clearly racing. That night, he barely spoke to her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his insistence on handling things alone would only lead to disaster. The following morning, Charles left the house earlier than usual. He didn't mention where he was going, nor did he leave a note. Evelyn assumed he was heading to the church, but as the hours passed without a word from him, her anxiety deepened. She called his phone multiple times, but each call went straight to voicemail. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn's unease turned to panic. Something felt terribly wrong. She replayed his parting words from the previous night, his vague assurances that he would take care of everything, and realized how final they had sounded. Her intuition screamed that Charles was in trouble, and she needed help before it was too late. With no other options, Evelyn contacted the police. She explained the situation, carefully choosing her words to protect Charles's reputation while conveying the urgency of her fears. She detailed the blackmail scheme, the emotional toll it had taken on her husband, and her growing belief that he was planning something drastic. The authorities took Evelyn's concerns seriously. They began tracing Charles's movements, pulling traffic camera footage and using cell phone tower data to determine his location. The search led them to a notorious brothel on the outskirts of New Orleans, a place with a history of illicit activity and a reputation for catering to powerful clients. Officers were immediately dispatched to the address. Evelyn waited anxiously for updates, her heart pounding with every passing second. She prayed that the police would reach Charles in time, that whatever he was planning could be stopped before it spiraled out of control. The brothel, hidden behind an unassuming facade in the outskirts of New Orleans, was a sight of unimaginable horror when the police arrived. The building was eerily quiet, the heavy scent of gunpowder and blood lingering in the stale air. Officers moved cautiously through the dimly lit hallways, their boots leaving faint impressions in the pools of blood that stained the floor. Every corner of the brothel bore the marks of violence, from overturned furniture to bullet holes riddling the walls. In one of the inner rooms, they found Charles Monroe. He was slumped in the corner, his back against the wall and his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His once clear eyes were wide and unfocused, staring blankly at the devastation around him. A pistol lay discarded on the floor nearby, its barrel still warm. Charles's clothes were soaked with blood, though most of it wasn't his own. His lips moved faintly, whispering fragments of prayers or apologies that no one could decipher. The bodies of 8 adults, 5 men and 3 women, were strewn across the brothel's various rooms. Investigators quickly noted that the victims ranged from brothel workers to clients. It was a chaotic scene, with no clear distinction as to who had been targeted. The wounds on the victims were brutal, many struck multiple times, as if Charles had acted with unrelenting fury. The walls bore the splatter patterns of close-range gunfire, and the floor was littered with shell casings. Piecing together the sequence of events, investigators surmised that Charles had entered the brothel with a singular purpose, to confront the owners about the blackmail. Witnesses later testified that he had demanded the destruction of the video and an end to the extortion. When his demands were refused, something inside him snapped. Overwhelmed by fear, shame, and anger, Charles had drawn his weapon and opened fire. The initial shots appeared to have been aimed at the owners of the brothel. Their bodies were found in an office near the back, slumped over desks that still held incriminating evidence of their illegal operations. But Charles hadn't stopped there. In his rage, he had turned his weapon on anyone who crossed his path, unable, or unwilling, to differentiate between those complicit in the blackmail and those who were merely bystanders. When the shooting stopped, the once respected pastor was left alone in the silence, surrounded by the consequences of his actions. The weapon fell from his hand, and he sank to the floor, his mind fracturing under the weight of what he had done. Hours later, when the police burst through the doors, they found him in the same position, his whispered prayers barely audible above the officer's commands. Charles offered no resistance as he was arrested. His body was limp as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, and he did not protest as he was led out of the brothel. He was a shadow of the man he had once been, consumed by guilt and despair. The officers noted his muttered phrases, fragments of apologies to those he had killed and pleas for divine forgiveness. The investigators continued their grim task, documenting the crime scene in painstaking detail. Every bloodstain, bullet hole, and body placement told a story of rage and desperation. The brothel's seedy underbelly was laid bare, with evidence of its blackmail operations uncovered alongside the human toll of Charles's rampage. The massacre left an indelible scar on New Orleans. The revelation of Reverend Charles Monroe's double life and the horrific violence he committed shocked both his congregation and the wider community. News outlets ran relentless coverage of the events, dissecting every detail of his fall from grace. The man who had once been a symbol of hope and morality was now a central figure in one of the most heinous crimes the city had witnessed. Charles faced a barrage of charges, including 8 counts of first-degree murder. His defense team crafted a narrative of desperation and psychological torment, arguing that years of internalized shame and the extortion scheme had pushed him into a temporary state of insanity. They presented testimony from psychologists who described the immense pressure he had endured. The defense painted him as a man caught in an unrelenting storm of guilt, fear, and self-loathing, who snapped under the weight of it all. The prosecution, however, focused on the calculated nature of the crime. They emphasized the cold reality of 8 lives brutally taken and argued that regardless of his emotional state, Charles had entered the brothel with a loaded weapon and a clear intent to kill. They pointed to the indiscriminate nature of the violence, highlighting that not all the victims were complicit in the blackmail. For the jury, this was not just an act of desperation, it was a premeditated act of vengeance. Evelyn Monroe found herself at the center of the media frenzy. The quiet life she had once shared with Charles was replaced by invasive questions, flashing cameras, and relentless scrutiny. She was torn between her love for the man she had shared decades with and the horror of what he had done. Evelyn chose to stand by Charles during the trial, not to excuse his actions but to provide context. She testified about the blackmail and the emotional deterioration she had witnessed in her husband, pleading for leniency and explaining that he had acted out of fear and despair. Despite her testimony and the defense's arguments, the jury was unanimous in their verdict. Charles was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the community that had once revered him was left to grapple with the aftermath. The impact on the church was immediate and devastating. Congregants abandoned the once thriving institution, unable to reconcile their faith with the actions of their spiritual leader. The building itself, once filled with the sound of hymns and prayers, became a haunting reminder of betrayal and loss. Eventually, the church closed its doors, its congregation scattering to other places of worship. For Evelyn, the weight of her husband's crimes became unbearable. The home they had shared for decades felt suffocating, its walls filled with memories tainted by the tragedy. Unable to stay in New Orleans, she moved to a neighboring state, seeking a fresh start. Evelyn found solace in using her story to advocate for mental health awareness, speaking at events and sharing her experiences to help others recognize the importance of seeking help before desperation leads to destruction. Charles, now confined to a prison cell, spent his days in solitude. The once charismatic pastor was a shadow of his former self, consumed by remorse and haunted by the lives he had taken. He devoted himself to prayer, seeking forgiveness from a higher power for the irreversible damage he had caused. Yet, even in his moments of reflection, the weight of his actions remained inescapable. The tragedy of Charles Monroe became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the destructive power of secrets, shame, and unchecked desperation. It was a story that resonated deeply within the community, highlighting the fragility of the human spirit when confronted with overwhelming pressure. Charles's name, once associated with sermons of redemption and hope, was now a somber warning of how easily a life built on faith and trust could crumble under the weight of hidden truths.